So I'm back here with another Xiaomi mobile phone. This is the Mi 5X, it's just come out. And this one here is an interesting one because they're using a Snapdragon 625 in there. And I was really hoping for the Snapdragon 630 at least in this build here. So it's got a 5.5 inch 1080p screen on there, dual cameras on the rear, both of them are 12 megapixels. And a 3000 milliamp hour battery, so that is smaller than what I would have thought. I was hoping for maybe 4000 milliamp hours. Now the Snapdragon 625 is an efficient chipset, so battery life on this should still be good even though it's only 3000 milliamp hours. And on the rear there's a fingerprint reader, and apparently they do have a high quality audio DAC in this. So it has 4 gigabytes of RAM and it's got dual SIM, and I think it also supports micro SD cards on there, which will be great because it's not the flagship. The flagships, Xiaomi always drops the micro SD cards, don't they? Type-C port and a front-facing 5 megapixel camera. Okay, so there's our box here, typical Xiaomi box, and this is the 64 gigabyte version. And it is still factory sealed, which is great. So there's no global ROM version of this just yet. I think that'll come out later, or perhaps we'll have to flash over the global ROM on this. So there's the phone. I'll put that aside for a second. Have a look at what's inside the box. Okay, they've changed things a little bit here. So they've got the SIM tool on the bottom, and then inside this, I think, here we have the Type-C cable in white, and where on earth is the charger? Oh, there it is, right at the bottom. And then the charger, this is very small, and the reason that charger is so small is because it's only rated to 5 volts, 2 amps, so not a quick charge 3 charger, but you should be able to just use one, a third-party one, and it will hopefully work, but I'll test that out later on. And then an instruction leaflet which is all in Chinese, but I just noticed too that it points out how the arrangement is of the SIM tray, so it's either 2 nano SIMs, micro SD card, and another nano SIM. So just check the weight of it, 164 grams. And a very thin 7.5 millimeters, and that's without the camera bulge. The camera bulge adds a little bit more, it comes in at 8.2 almost, so very thin. So this is why we've lost some of that battery capacity, because they've slimmed it down. Personally, I would rather have a 4000 milliamp hour battery and it being a millimeter thicker. So on the rear there's always these stickers here, that's our IMEI number. Just going to pull that off and not expose that to the world. And on the front there is a screen protector on there, but this is just one that's for transit to stop the screen being scratched, and in the factory too. So now looking at the rear of the 5X, we have a dual camera setup. So the one on the right, the sensor on the right, you can see is with optical zoom. Larger lens on there, which is 2 times optical zoom. And then the one on the left doesn't have that zoom on there at all. Now there's no optical image stabilization or digital, I believe, on this phone, which is rather disappointing. Personally, I would rather have just the one sensor with optical image stabilization. But with these 2 sensors you can do those fancy bokeh effects, so you can get a blurred background and do those portrait shots that seem to be quite popular and very popular in China apparently. Below that, the fingerprint reader, which looks like the same hardware that we see on the Redmi series. Now just along the top here you'll see the antenna line is blending in with the curvature of the rear housing here, so they've done a nice job with that. Now the paint job on the back is made out of a matte black, and it looks like it is going to show fingerprints really easy. Along the top, an IR transmitter and secondary microphone for noise cancellation and for use in video. And then along the bottom, 3.5mm headphone jack. No, they haven't done anything silly yet by removing this, which is great to see. Microphone, torque screw, Type-C port, another torque screw, and then the loudspeaker. On the right side, metal, volume and power buttons. They've got a real good feel to them. They feel like quality, and shaking the phone, these buttons do not rattle either, which is good. Front-facing 5 megapixel camera, earpiece, and then our SIM tray here, which will take either a micro SD card and nano SIM or dual nano SIMs. Now it doesn't support European band 20, unfortunately, this phone. We're going to have to wait for an international model, if they ever do release it, that is, of this 5X. So the phone feels great in hand, very good. I like the access to the buttons on the side there, but you will notice one thing, that just handling it now for only a minute or two, look at all those fingerprint smudges all over the place. So it's not going to stay looking pristine for very long, is it?
Sliding in at just under $300, the Xiaomi Mi 5X is trying to compete in the upper mid-range smartphone market. And you'll notice almost seconds after taking it out the box that it has the design, the build quality, and the visual appeal to give it a good head start on this mission. It is a slim, trim, and compact smartphone, packing a lot of tech into a package that is as svelte as it is powerful. Now, one important thing to note here is that this phone has borrowed inspiration from the more high-end smartphones in terms of design. Although it's got a budget price tag, it's more reminiscent of phones like the OnePlus 5, for example, in terms of the way it's finished, which is nothing but a compliment. Even though it's not technically that much more expensive, its design is a vast departure and an improvement from the Redmi line of smartphones. It fits comfortably in the hand, is evenly weighted. My only complaint here would be that it damages a little bit too easily. If you accidentally rub a zip or a hard object or a key against it, you will probably leave a permanent mark. So what you need to know about this display is that first of all it has a pretty standard 5.5-inch 1080p display, which gives it a good level of sharpness, but also that it uses a slightly different display technology to the more high-end phones that it's trying to imitate. And what this gives us is a fairly natural colour palette, but a contrast that really isn't that great. Also a brightness of 450 nits, which means in broad daylight you're going to have a little bit of trouble reading the screen. The bezels on the top and the bottom are pretty chunky, but at least the ones on the sides have been trimmed down. Now, another aspect of the phone that's a little bit disappointing is the speakers. They reach a reasonable volume but have this slightly echoey feel to them. They lack clarity, which is more or less a basic requirement for a phone's speaker. Bit of a shame. In contrast, the fingerprint scanner on the back is up there with the very best. It is not only fast, makes few mistakes, but is also easy to feel for. Now, apart from the design, the other main departure of this phone from the Redmi Note line of smartphones would be that 12-megapixel dual camera. And this is a detailed camera that captures lots of colour and has a fast shutter time, so even when you turn down that brightness, even when you go indoors, you preserve quite a bit of the detail. And one thing worth noting is that the maximum aperture of the rear cameras without this fancy bokeh mode is f2.2, so without using the portrait mode, you don't really get too much bokeh on these shots. Having said that, when we switch over to portrait mode, the bokeh is incredible. Sometimes it does fail, just like with any other smartphone, and it does take longer to take your photos, so you do have to hold the camera steady, but when it works really well. I would say the best way of summarizing this camera is that it gives you a glimpse into what the high-end smartphones can do. It gives you the ability to take similar kind of photos you can take with $600 flagships, but it's just a little bit less consistent. The front camera isn't bad, isn't too great either, but the video here is really rather impressive. This is 4K 30 frames per second footage, and it comes out crisp, clear, and fairly well stabilized. What is a bit of a shame here is that internally the Mi 5X is more or less identical to the Xiaomi Redmi Note 4X, which is undoubtedly a phone intended for more budget-oriented consumers. Having said that, it's not a slow phone. With the Snapdragon 625 and 4GB of RAM, we're getting about 63,000 on Antutu, which gives us more than enough power to essentially run the operating system very smoothly, to multitask between a lot of different demanding applications and still have RAM to spare, and also to game on almost anything you want to. This can play all your standard 3D, 2D, 2.5D games, and you really shouldn't have too much of a problem. The only times you might start to notice the lack of power is when playing the most demanding games. If you're playing your Modern Combats or your Novas, you might start to notice a dropped frame every now and again. Or when you're launching or loading an application, things do happen at a noticeably slower pace compared to phones with the Snapdragon 835, for example. Now in terms of software, the phone I've got here is the Chinese version, so it's still got MIUI 8, so I can't bring you my full impressions of the new software MIUI 9, which the international one should be shipping with. Having said that, MIUI does feel right at home on this device. It runs well, it's slick, it's smooth, and as customizable as ever. If you don't like the standard launcher, you can always switch over to something like Nova Launcher like I've done here. The only thing worth bearing in mind is if you are going to buy the Chinese version, you are going to have to find a way to sideload the Play Store, which can be a bit of a pain. Unfortunately, the slim body of this smartphone does come at a slight cost in battery life. Compared to the Redmi Note line of phones, this one only has 3080 mAh, which is noticeably smaller. Having said that, it still translates into a perfectly reasonable level of battery life. Flicking between YouTube, installing applications, and gaming, you can still get a full day's use out of this guy. but it's worth bearing in mind that further down the line when you've used the phone for a bit, that same battery life may not continue to hold. It's also worth noting that as well as the 32 or 64GB of internal storage, this is one of the only Mi smartphones to support a microSD card slot, which is a huge bonus. So guys, that is the Xiaomi Mi 5X. Whilst it looks and feels every bit like a premium flagship, there are times when you're using it where you'll start to realise why it isn't.